Another warm welcome for Adam Curtis.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And thank you very much for your kind introduction. Many thanks to Corinne, to Convoco. Many thanks to you all. When Corinne rang me, and basically, like every year, we discussed about who could be the artist or filmmaker present here. At Convoco, Corinne mentioned the theme of the many different futures of capitalism. And the first thing which came to my mind was a story the late Christoph Schlingensief once told me, the amazing theater director, artist, politician, activist, born at the very beginning of the 60s, and he grew up in the German town of Oberhausen as the son of a pharmacist. So his father was a member of the local Rotary Club, and basically Christoph was always having this feeling that there was never any doubt involved and any question. And then one day, his father came home from the Rotary Club and said there was this very strange thing, that this artist had been present and given a lecture called Joseph Beuys. So the Rotary Club in Oberhausen had invited Joseph Beuys to give a talk, and that's probably somewhere in the 70s, right? He's born at the beginning of the 60s. It was during his childhood, adolescence, so kind of mid-70s. And Beuys predicted that somehow towards the very end of the 20th century or the very beginning of the 21st century, capitalism would end. And what is interesting is that Christoph was so impressed that his father talked about that for so many weeks that he thought, there must be a power in art. And that's the day he decided to become an artist. I always thought was somehow a wonderful story. Christoph told me that, the very first time we met. The other thing which, of course, came to my mind when Corinne called was my professor, the late Hans-Christoph Binswanger, at the University in St. Gallen. I studied with him at the very end of the 80s, and Binswanger directed the University of St. Gallen's Institute for Economics and Ecology, and examined basically the historical relationship of economics, of ecology, and also of alchemy. He wrote an amazing book called Money and Magic, where he traced the deep associations between these different fields, and of course has then specialized in this whole idea of limits of growth and how we actually can only survive if we introduce ecology in the kind of equation of future economies. And he always told me about Goethe, which was interesting, and this idea that actually a great writer, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, was at a certain moment very involved as a minister, as a politician in economic decisions. And that, of course, leads us to something which is extremely interesting if we talk about the future. It's the involvement of artists in the center of society. It's the involvement of artists in discussions about the future, not only of art, but about the future of society, which is why it's so wonderful that Corinne, for each Convoco conference, invites an artist, a filmmaker, to be part of these discussions, as very recently in a conversation about artificial intelligence in Berlin, Hito Steyer. And of course, John Latham and Barbara Stevini founded in the 1960s this organization called the Artist Placement Group in London, where they basically said that every company, every ministry, every brand, every corporation should have an artist in residence. And I think that's a great idea, and we should somehow try to implement that into the 21st century. Now, Adam, of course, needs no introduction. His films have been seen by so many millions of people all over the world. You can all see them on YouTube. They are all online. He has been working since 1983 on films within the BBC, using BBC archival footage. Power, we can say, is very often from the very beginning the theme of these films, power, how it works in society. Some of the films I would like to mention here: The Power of Nightmares, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, The Century of the Self. We're going to talk about that later in relation to the theme here. And of course, the film we're going to talk about today, Hypernormalization, which is the most recent film of Adam Curtis. And before I start my first questions, Adam, I think, wanted to begin with a few observations and reactions to the previous panels. I unfortunately missed the beginning of the conference because of the airport disaster this morning in Munich. But Adam was here, and he's gonna, before I start with my questions, tell us some observations and reflections.
Thank you. I asked Hans Ulrich whether I could just say this, because I've been sitting out there all afternoon. I'm a journalist. I'm not an artist. I'm a journalist. And what journalists are really good at is, I mean, it's the only thing they're good at. Everything else they're very bad at. But what they're really good at is going out and finding out what people think and feel. What I was slightly shocked about this afternoon was that no one on the panel mentioned the people and what the people think about capitalism. Really. They're the people that you are running this system in the name of. That's your job. Your job is to actually make that system work for the people. And I just wanted to very quickly tell you that you've got a real problem. Really serious problem. And I don't think you're really facing up to it in any of the conversations you had here this afternoon. In my country and in America, which is really all I can talk about, the people, and that we're not just talking about what Mrs. Clinton called the deplorables, but large amounts of the people think that capitalism gives them no future, may not even be capitalism any longer, may have mutated into something else, but certainly is not in their interests. It started with the Iraq War, when those in charge, the think tanks, the politicians, the journalists, lied to the population, led them into a bloody war, which then led indirectly and directly to the refugee crisis you now have around here, which no one knows how to solve. Then there was a financial crisis, in which I suppose we members of the mafia would call it skimming and rigging, was shown to be happening on a very large scale in America and Britain, and no one was prosecuted, no one high up was prosecuted, no one was sent to jail. And then we now live in a world where the people, millions of the people, borrow money of such fantastic amount off the banks to buy a small apartment. They will never be able to pay it back, but the apartment is so far outside the city that they have to actually spend the rest of their income on transport backwards and forwards. So sometimes they can't even buy themselves lunch. And I'm not just talking about poor people, I'm talking about people who work in my organisation, the BBC, cannot afford lunch sometimes because they have spent all that money to the banks and to the transport because their apartment is now in zone 6, because the property prices are so high. The only lunch they have is on Mondays when Starbucks does half-price vouchers. They look forward to that. These are middle-class people. There is real anger. And what they really ask themselves is, what is this all for? And I was brought up to believe that democracy and capitalism were intimately linked. We gave you our vote, so you would take us somewhere which would make life better for us. That link seems to have broken in the minds of millions and millions of people in my country and America. And I'm slightly shocked that you didn't mention it, that view. And it's going to cause you real problems unless you address it. It really is. Because if we don't know what something is for, we're going to turn to someone else who is going to tell us stories about what it's for, and it ain't capitalism. I can tell you that. And I just think that was my main observation. I think you're all very clever, and much cleverer than I am, at knowing all this stuff. I just wanted to report to you, as a journalist, what the people feel, that capitalism gives them no future. None. Zero, because it doesn't tell them a story any longer about where they're going. What is it all for? That's what I want. That's my little rant over.
It's interesting.
Thank you.
It's very interesting because it reminds me of something Stats Terkel always told me, who, like, of course, like you, has been a great historian and as a journalist and oral historian, has basically done more than 10,000 interviews, and he always said, you know, we have to listen. And last week I was with the poet Ethel Adnan, who is now in her 90s, the amazing poet in Paris and painter. And Ethel said the 20th century has all been about manifestos, often and sometimes very loud manifestos, and we should maybe in the 21st century listen more. This idea of listening seems to be very important. I wanted to ask you to talk about visions, because with Corinne we gave this panel the theme of visions. You often say that there is a lack of vision of the future. And of course, there's a problem in society when there is no vision for the future, unless it's not only about the short-term vision. It's interesting, Fernand Braudel talked about la longue durée, the long duration. And at the beginning of the 19th century, there were, of course, already, lots of ideas about what the 20th century could be. And we made a research actually last year about kind of visions of the next century, of the 22nd century, and there is a real lack of such visions. So I wanted to ask you to tell us about that, and maybe also when you think we stopped having visions.
1992, I think. In my mind, 1992 is the last great politician was Mrs. Thatcher. I mean, because she brought into this idea, actually from what was he called? Von Hayek, the Austrian economist, that you cannot impose your vision on millions of other people because it ends up being a totalitarian force. And that's why this is what the road to serfdom was all about. Mrs. Thatcher brought that, and she had this ideological vision that she was going to create a society where it was going to be impossible to enforce other people's visions on each other, that you were going to create a society where everyone had their vision, their own vision. It's called individualism, and it was the politics of individualism, and she did it beautifully. But what happened is that she then left the scene, rather grumpily, in 1991, 92, and her successors were faced by a society in which you were not allowed to take people anywhere else. By definition, you had become a manager. And I mean, I lived through this, and I was a journalist during that time, and you could see what was happening to politics. What politicians were puzzled about was that the old contract they had, which was, you give me your vote, and I will take you somewhere, didn't work any longer because you had to have a political party to do that, to give you power, and no one wanted to join a party any longer. They wanted to be individuals, and good for them. It was really good. It's really empowering to be an individual, but it screwed mass democracy. Mass democracy and individualism just doesn't work because it's like herding piglets. They're not all going to vote for you. They're just not. They're going to go like that, and they're going to go like that. So what you end up with is you give up being their representatives to those in power, which is the old idea of democracy, and you switch, and you become the managers of them. And I think that worked very well for about 15, when was the financial crisis? 18 years. No, 1992. 16 years. It worked beautifully because you used the money to lend people. Their wages seemed to go up, they could buy what they wanted, and everything was perfect. But what that system doesn't allow for is crisis, and you had a crisis. And that's when the politicians got puzzled, because if you're just a manager, what do you do when people start behaving badly? I mean, I've always maintained that if only my government and the government in America had put 50 bankers into jail in each country in 2008, we wouldn't have got Brexit, and you wouldn't have got Trump. I mean, it would have been seen by the electorate as an exercise of power in the interests of the people. But they didn't do it. They let it get away. And they didn't punish anyone. And at that point, a switch went in people's minds which said, these aren't really politicians any longer. These are just sort of managers. And whatever they say, there's a crisis, everyone goes, oh, it's terrible, and then nothing happens. And that's what people have got used to. And at that point, starting in 1992, and then when we began to realize in 2008, 2009, that they weren't going to do anything to change things when they go bad, we gave up any idea. We knew that they had no idea of the future. None. And that's where we are now.
And in your film, Hypernormalization, you actually go earlier than 92. You talk about something which happened in the 70s, because you said in the 70s there was a shift where basically self-expression became the new politics, self-expression basically as a way of seeing the world. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because it's pre-92.
Well, this is the one I always get in trouble about, because it involves an attack on art. And I don't know, it seems to me from listening to economists, they're very nice people. When you attack artists, they're not nice, they're really horrible. They go at you. And what I was simply questioning in that was, if you have the ideal of self-expression in a society, and that's at the centre of art, if you try and do radical art, whatever you say, however radical your message is, in a world driven by individualism, in which Nike wants to sell you sneakers so you can, quote, express yourself better, and all products are there to help you express yourself better, then if you're doing it through art and self-expression, whatever your message is, you're actually, in the way you are doing it, feeding the very beast that you're trying to destroy. You're making it stronger because you're reinforcing in people's minds the idea of self-expression. And it's a thing I said to Ulrich Obrist the other day. The most radical thing you could do today is to do something extraordinary and not tell anyone you've done it. Not write a book about it, not put it on Instagram, not tell your friends. Just do something really, really extraordinary and then not let anyone know you've done it. That would be much more radical than anything anyone could do, yeah? Which brings us back to this peculiar idea of that self-expression, which was born out of the radical ideas of the 60s, has now become the conformity of our time. But what's brilliant about it, in terms of the exercise of power, is self-expression is actually quite disempowering when really shit things happen. Sorry, bad word. When really bad things happen. It's great to be self-expressive when things are going really well. But when something goes really, really badly wrong, and you're left alone, expressing yourself in a tweet in big capital letters is not a very strong thing to do. It's just not. So you feel very lonely. And I just wonder whether the conformity is now acting not only just to keep people stable, but actually disempower them a bit. And really the most radical thing to do is to go back to the old ideas of politics, which is you join together with lots of other people. You sacrificed quite a lot of your own self-expression and your own self-satisfaction for other people. Which if, briefly, we could go back to what Mrs. Flick was talking about at the beginning, we possibly go back to what Adam Smith said right at the beginning, which is about the whole idea of morals. This way, it's central to his idea of capitalism. It's not just about the market. It's about you having the capacity and wanting to think about how other people feel, and possibly you could make them feel better. And that maybe is what's coming, and that maybe is what's going to rescue capitalism, but I'm not sure.
And you, of course, gave the film the title Hypernormalization, and that comes from a 2006 book about the final decade of the Soviet Union. Everything was forever until it was no more. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about how you found the title? Because it's kind of interesting, I think, in relation to this conversation. And also a little bit more about hypernormalization. I think it would be interesting also to hear about this risk adversity, because last time we met, you talked about this idea of a risk adversity, and I was kind of wondering where you see that come from, and also how we can go beyond it. How can we supersede this risk adversity? Okay. It's two questions, really.
That's all right. It's a really good book. I would recommend it to everyone. It's written by a Russian guy. He's at, where is he, on the West Coast somewhere? Berkeley. It's
Alexei
Yurchak.
Yeah.
It's a history of the collapse of the Soviet Union during the 1980s, told in a way at a level of what I was talking about earlier on, about how people felt. It wasn't about the grand level, it was about what it felt like to live through that collapse from about 1983 through to 1989, well, 91. And Yurchak coins this phrase in this book to describe what it felt like. And I think this is so important when you're discussing the future of capitalism, or the future of anything, is what it feels like for the millions of people, because it depends upon them what then happens. And what he described in this was what it felt like to live through the Soviet Union collapsing, was that you all knew that everyone in power was corrupt. The managers of the state plan were corrupt, the technocrats above them running the whole thing, the whole apparatus of administration, and the politicians in power, all were corrupt, but not only that, everyone knew that they had no idea of an alternative. They were stuck. So everyone was living through this world that they knew was sort of wrong. But because no one at any level had any other idea, they just accepted it as normal. And what Yurchak coined was this phrase, which I just think is brilliant. He called it hypernormalization. You knew that it was all wrong, but because no one was giving you any alternative, you just went along with it and went, that's normal. And in my film, what I argued was that in many ways, although we're not, in Britain and America, not like the Soviet Union at all, we are living through that same slow-motion, strange world. In my country, Everyone knows that those in power accept the corruption and don't do anything about it. Endless stories of corruption come out in the newspapers. The journalists make a great fuss. Everyone goes on about how wonderful investigative journalism is, and then nothing happens. And it happens again and again and again. And we also know that those in charge, and I include the administrative class of the financial system in this as well, have no idea of an alternative either. And we accept it. So I was arguing simply in that film that we're pretty hypernormal at the moment. And we're just waiting to see what happens. Because we know that the people in charge aren't going to do anything. Nothing. You look at what's happening with Brexit in my country. Nothing. I mean, it's funny, but that's it. They have no idea. But there's a whole apparatus of think tanks. I mean, I blame the think tanks, they're the really bad ones, who have to pretend that actually everyone talking about Brexit knows what they're talking about. I don't know if any of you have ever read a novel by Charles Dickens called Bleak House. The central MacGuffin of Bleak House is a law case called Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. The whole plot of 800 pages revolves around this plot. It's a law case that no one can remember what it's about. No one. And that's what Brexit is like. No one actually can remember the arguments. But there's a whole apparatus that has to pretend that they do. But we know that they're pretending, and they know that we know that they're pretending. Now, it really is like that. And that's very, very strange. I mean, it's a sort of work of high art in a way. That you've got all these so-called clever, highly educated people who've managed to create this apparatus that's lifting off the air, and no one can remember what it's about. It's really great. I mean, it's not, because it actually could lead to tragic consequences, but it is sort of absurd. That's what I'm really trying to say. And politics and the administrative class just can't deal with absurdity at the moment. I mean, what we're waiting for is a politician who can deal with absurdity, can bring that absurdity forward, make us look at it and say, this is why it's happening, we will use this and we'll go elsewhere. But at the moment, we haven't got one.
So I was thinking, actually, this morning, it's fascinating you mentioned this Dickens book. Yeah, I was thinking, what are the novels, about the Brexit? And I think Ali Smith's book is a great first attempt at writing the Brexit novel. When we met for the first time, maybe 7-8 years ago, we organized a retrospective of your works, and together with Liam Gillick at eFlux, Liam made an exhibition design, a display for this show, and you agreed to do the exhibition only under one condition, which is that I wouldn't call you an artist. We agreed to that. We called you a journalist and documentary filmmaker. But it was interesting that in that first conversation at the time, I asked you who are your heroes or heroines, the most important people for you as inspiration, and you immediately answered Max Weber. So I wanted to ask you in relation to hypernormalization, because of course Weber wrote about this iron cage of efficiency and this idea of how we can break out, maybe, of this cage. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that, why Max Weber is so important, and how you think we can go beyond the kind of current state of managerialism. And you've already alluded to it, but I'd like to hear more in terms of a to-do list. Well, what can we do?
I think Weber's fascinating because he anticipated the rise of bureaucracy and the managerial system, and its constant attempts to take power away from politics and hold it stable and static. I mean, I think that was... He got there before anyone else. And the iron cage of rationality, which is what he's talking about, is fascinating. I mean, I know I'm in a room full of economists, but I must, okay, I'll do it. Politics somewhere got captured by economics, where economic rationality has now colonized the whole of politics. I think that happened in 1992, by the way. I think economics has a very powerful role to play in politics, and a very good role. But at the moment, the politicians, when they gave up their old idea of representing us and became managers, embraced a utilitarian philosophy, which was you can measure outcomes, you want to achieve stability, and that's your job. And what you were talking about risk, I did a sort of search. It's not brilliantly scientific, but on LexisNexis, of the use of the word risk and stability. It really only starts, guess when? 1992. That's when the word risk starts to be used. And again, I think it's part of this shift in politics that happened, is you went from this idea of being part of a dynamic process of history, that you were taking the people somewhere. And that's what Mrs. Thatcher thought too. She was taking the people somewhere. You give that up, and you go for a static, managed model of the world, that your job is to keep things stable, to stop risk. You don't take risks any longer as a politician because you know that the ideological thing that's gone very deep into people's brains is you'll get massacred if something bad happens. So what you are is a manager. And therefore risk becomes the sort of the thing you must hold on to. And I think that's dangerous because whilst that works in a technical area of economic management and risk planning for all sorts of industrial things, if you're a leader of human beings, of the people, and you say, my job is to keep you safe and to keep you stable, what happens to your imagination is this. You give up on imagining good things in the future, which is what the old politics used to do. And the right wing as well did it. They both imagined good things and they said, I'll take you there. If you're saying, I'm going to keep you safe, you have to imagine the worst. And what I noticed, I did a whole series of films about what happened after 9/11 and the hysteria about the apocalyptic vision that was coming our way of terrorism. If you give up, if you have to imagine what could happen, your imagination knows no bounds. So you start imagining very dark things. And I think that's also what happened to my politics, and especially in my country, is the politicians started to imagine the worst. And when that spreads through a society, that infects not only the imagination of the politics, but the imagination of everyone. And everyone becomes frightened. I don't know about your society, but in my society, the thing that's humming away in the back of people's minds is, oh God, what's going to happen next? There is that fear. It sits there, it hums away. And I think it's because we gave up this idea, no, we can be strong together, or we can go forward into the future, and we replaced it with this idea, we're going to stay where we are, stable, and we're going to protect you against the darkness. And I just don't think that's a very good place for politicians to be. Because when really difficult things happen, not bad things, difficult things happen, like the financial crisis of 2008, you don't know what to do because you haven't got an alternative. As I said earlier on, it's hypernormal, and you just live with it. And meanwhile, everyone is a little bit jangly. In the mood in my country, it's jangly, it's nervous. Everyone feels just slightly insecure, not terrified, just slightly insecure. And there isn't an administrative class that understands how to deal with that. But there are people coming who do know how to deal with that, and they tell you big, dramatic stories that sweep you up and stop that jangly feeling and make you feel part of something big. But they're not Democrats. And unless you pull yourself together, they're the people who are going to come and grab you and stop that jangly feeling and make you feel big. It's, it's coming. It really is.
Now, at the beginning, I mentioned, Joseph Beuys, and of course, the protagonist of social sculpture. There is a great interest right now in many younger artists in this idea of social sculpture. And I think one of the ways to address the things you've been describing is the idea of transcending, oneself and joining together with other people. Now, you've talked about that in our previous interview. You said if a novelist is going to come along and write the grand novel of our time, I think the sensibility will have to deal with the interaction between the desire of the individual to feel and experience everything themselves. Yeah, I know, we have 2 minutes, right? And how that desire can transcend the immediacy.
Do the blockchain question.
So, 2 last questions. The one question is, how can the idea of the collective be reconciled with the commitment, of individualism? How do you see that?
It's the big problem. It's if you live in a world of individualism, how do you get people back together again, into a collective group, to actually use that power creatively? How do you get people to surrender some of their individualism for something good when they just want to be individuals? I mean, I know it myself. I don't want to join a political party. I want to be an individual. That's the thing of our time. It's very difficult. When the internet came along, I thought it had squared the circle, because what the internet is brilliant at doing is letting you feel that you're in control of your own destiny, because you're going wherever you want with your fingers. But actually, it's like a Ouija board, because behind the screen, the machines can look at all the patterns that you're making with lots of other people and see that you're actually very similar, agglomerates you together, and can actually see you as a group while you're still feeling you're an individual. And when the internet started, I thought that might be what the internet was going to do. It was going to be the solution to this problem. It got hijacked somewhere towards the end of the 90s by these 4 firms who are simply using it to advertise stuff to us. And they've grabbed that.
And that brings us to the last question. It's a question about the blockchain. Now, if you talk about future capitalisms, I wanted to bring up the blockchain. I'm making this research now. Many artists at the moment do projects related to that. Simon Denny, also actually Matt Liss and Avery Singer, they create a blockchain religion. Lots of artists work with blockchain. There is also a lot of projects right now which work on new cooperative models across geographies using blockchain with artists. I wanted to ask you your take on that. What's the future of blockchain?
They all talk about blockchain at the moment. I have 2 problems with blockchain. One, it's always men that talk to you about blockchain. I've never met a woman who talks about blockchain. So I've got a bit of a suspicion there. What I think fundamental about blockchain is this. I think, just to go back to the original question that Mrs. Flick asked right at the beginning of this, is what is the future of capitalism? What my brain says to me is, I'll tell you where capitalism is at the moment. It's at that point where the Catholic Church collapsed and Protestantism came in. It's not that people didn't like religion. What they thought was that the Catholic Church had become totally corrupted. Indulgences, you bought them as an excuse for not having to actually really be religious. It had become a completely corrupt system that actually everyone knew didn't really have any belief any longer. And along came Martin Luther and argued that you should go back to basics. And I have a feeling about capitalism. It's not going to, given all the warnings I've been ranting on about, I don't think you're going to get revolution. I think what you're going to get is people saying, we want to go back to we want to renew capitalism. We want to go back let's bring the word free back in. But let's go back to Adam Smith, and with Adam Smith, bring moral sentiment into it. Because that's the key thing about what Smith was talking about, is you have the free market, and it works beautifully. And you have that idea of freedom of the individual to actually change the world, change their own world and be in control of their own destiny. But they are also good people. All this shit about hardwired, it's rubbish. People are not hardwired into anything. They can be all sorts of things. And that's what Smith was trying to point out in that idea of moral sentiment, is that people actually quite like it if they can make other people feel better. And if you can combine that with the market, then you've got a beautiful idea. And I suspect that might be what will happen to capitalism. I'm afraid it might mean that the giant administrative think tank industrial conglomerate will get swept away, and what will come back is this idea of the individual connecting through money, through the market, to their own destiny, which brings me in a long way to blockchain, because that might be what blockchain does. What destroyed the power of the Catholic Church was printing, because they no longer had a monopoly on information and data. It wasn't called that then. The same may be true of blockchain. It may be a way of reinventing your relationship to money and power as an individual, and you get rid of the hierarchy, like you got rid of the hierarchy in the Catholic Church. The only problem with it is that blockchain doesn't tell you a story. Blockchain is a technocratic boys thing. It doesn't tell you an emotional story. It's just like I didn't hear an emotional story this afternoon. You're only going to get the people back if you tell them an emotional story, a really powerful story, which is what Luther did. That's what Protestantism is about. You can connect to God yourself. That's what you're waiting for, but maybe it will combine with blockchain.
Adam, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming.